Good afternoon. My name is Luis Martinez Tudillo, and I am a professor and director of the European Studies Group at the University of Iowa. Today, our group welcomes Professor Simon Glendinning to discuss his paper, Europe, a Community That Is Not One. During the preliminary remarks by the author and our initial dialogue, please feel free to send your questions and comments for Professor Glendinning using the Q&A tool. Sarolta Petersen will serve as our moderator. Thank you, Sarolta, and thank you all for viewing. We also appreciate the support of international programs at the University of Iowa for sponsoring this event. Simon Glendinning received his PhD at the University of Oxford and is currently Professor of European Philosophy in the European Institute at the London School of Economics and Political Science. He previously taught at the Universities of Kent and Reading. Until 2018, he also served as director of the wonderfully diverse Forum for European Philosophy, which I highly recommend as a fantastic source for very engaging writing and podcasts on science, culture, and politics from a philosophical perspective. When Professor Glendinning joined the European Institute at LSE in 2004, his work focused on European philosophy and also its relation to Anglophone analytic philosophy. He quickly came to see that if he had a future in the European Institute, he would have to shift from European philosophy to philosophy of Europe, a sub-area of philosophy which barely existed and which he has been inventing in his own way. His thought on this theme has been developed in the preparation of an extremely ambitious book in 2 volumes entitled Europe, a Philosophical History. Volume 1 is subtitled The Promise of Modernity, while Volume 2 is subtitled Beyond Modernity. The 2 volumes will be published simultaneously next spring by Routledge. He is currently working on a new book entitled Giving Up the Ghost, Magic, Religion, Science. His previous work includes books on Jacques Derrida, continental philosophy, and phenomenology, books which are, I should add, exceptionally clear, something to be emphasized and grateful for, given the intricate subject matter he deals with. As another devoted thinker of our European topic today, José Ortega y Gasset used to say, clarity is the courtesy of the philosopher. In the case of our guest, clarity can even extend to humor. I have actually laughed out loud reading some of Professor Glendinning's work. Professor Glendinning, thank you so much for showing us your courtesy with your clarity and your kindness at accepting our invitation. Although many of our viewers have read your paper, it would be great if you could start by telling us a bit more about that notion of Europe as a community that is not one.
Well, thank you very much, Louise. It's wonderful to be in Iowa. This is a spectral presence for me in amongst you. I suppose all of us here right now are in this mode, but still it's lovely to be with you. It's the evening here. I'm actually in Oxford, and it's an unusual time to be trying to do philosophy, but I'm delighted to do so. For those of you who did read the paper, apologies. Apologies in particular for the failure on my part to put any page numbers on the pages. It's a difficult time at the moment. There's a lot going on. I wouldn't normally do that, but I hope you were able to follow. For those who have not read it, don't worry, I'm going to say a little bit about it now. But as a kind of preliminary, I want to pick up something that Luis said about the work that I've been doing, that I've been calling Philosophy of Europe, and writing this book, 2-volume book, Europe, a Philosophical History. Consider for yourself what you might try to do if you were thinking about Europe in abstraction from all European state particularity. So we could think about Europe, first of all, in terms of its states, and these ancient states, some of them, that constitute this European place. But think about thinking about Europe in abstraction from that for a moment. Whether we could talk about a universality of a European condition. And one of the things that I've been particularly concerned to explore is the idea of a universality of a modern European condition. And there we're beginning to talk about Europe as such. And much of my work on Europe aims to explore something distinctively European. It aims, as it were, at that level of discourse where we want to be able to speak about Europe as such, and a distinctively European self-understanding, and particularly of Europe's understanding of itself as modern, a universal or near universal condition that is understood by Europeans, as it were, somebody whose cultural context circulates in that European place. That universal condition has always been understood as belonging to something more than a merely European history. When philosophy has sought to give an account of what it means to be European, and in particular to what it means to be a modern European, there's always an implicit, but often explicit, background thought of a universal history of everyone, a history of what in the past would have been called man, the history of man or of humanity or mankind. There's an idea there of what they call man having a history which moves from some initial, more or less primitive condition towards some increasingly civilized, rational, scientific, technological condition. And Europe has always represented itself and its modernity in relation to that universal history. So a universality of Europe emerges in philosophy in relation to a universal history of humanity in general. Now, man there, mankind, humanity, is already understood in a European way when European thinkers think about Europe like this. It's not a neutral conception of man or a conception of man which falls from nowhere. It falls precisely from the place that is being representing itself as at the head of that development. And that understanding of man has two fundamental sources, and these fundamental sources of the understanding of what a human being is are also characteristically the fundamental sources for Europe's culture in general, if you can speak that way. A conception of man that comes down to us from, on the one hand, Greek philosophy, where man is understood, and here's some Greek, I don't know what the subtitle is going to make of this, but it's the zoon, logon, echon, which means the, roughly speaking, the animal with the capacity for the logos, which was translated into the Latin of the Roman Republic as ratio. So comes down to us as the idea of the rational animal, human being as the rational animal. And this other source, a biblical source, where, and particularly influential through Christianity in Europe, the idea of man as made in God's image. So there's, as it were, the whole realm of creation, but human beings are distinctive in that they are uniquely made in God's image. So you have, combining those, an idea of man as theomorphic, that's the made in the image of God part, theomorphic, rational animality. And that animal that they call man, which is the being they say that we are, all of us, universally human, that being has a history which is a history of its self-realization, sometimes called its emancipation or de-alienation, a movement of progress towards its becoming actually what it already is potentially, with Europe at the head. This is a profoundly Eurocentric vision of the development of a universal humanity. And it's that classic discourse of Europe's modernity that I explore in the books, Europe, a Philosophical History, and the trouble that that conception has arrived at in our time. But the thing that I'm talking about today is something that I cannot altogether duck when telling something about this place, Europe. Whenever this place recalls itself to itself, it understands itself as already differentiated internally. It thinks of itself in some way as constituted by a plurality. The great French poet, but also a great essayist, Paul Valerie, writing about the French, says that the French specialize in the sense of the universal. So he was thinking within this European landscape, we could pick out the French, as it were, in this way by seeing them as the ones who specialize in the sense of the universal. Now, I've been talking about the universal and certain kinds of universality since I opened my mouth this evening. So I would want to say that this is not an exclusively French specialism. And actually, I would want to say ultimately it's not a specifically European specialism. But when we look at discourses on a universal or near universal European condition, what we always find is that it's internally inflected by regional particularity, intra-European regional particularity. So as it were, a different Europe appears in the different appearances of Europe from these different parts of Europe. And the first screen that I'm going to share with you tonight is actually the beginning of the paper, where I tried to give a kind of representative image of the key variations in this self-elaboration of Europe from inside itself. I'm going to make an effort here to share a screen with you. So I hope you can see that. This is a quotation from Algerian-born French philosopher Jacques Derrida, a book on Europe called The Other Heading. And he gives a nice little summary of the typical variations that we find in Europe. In its physical geography, and in what has often been called by Husserl, for example, its spiritual geography, Europe has always recognized itself as a cape or a headland, either as the advanced extreme of a continent to the west and south, the Land's End, the advanced point of a Finisterre, Europe of the Atlantic, or of the Greco-Latino-Iberian shores of the Mediterranean, the point of departure for discovery, invention, and colonization, or as the very center of this tongue in the form of a cape, the Europe of the middle, coiled up, indeed compressed along a Greco-Germanic axis at the very center of the cape. Now, within each figure that's identified there, these different figures of Europe, Europe of the middle, Europe of the Atlantic, Europe of the Mediterranean, each Europe is configured differently in turn from these different figures. And one of the things I talk about at the beginning of my paper is Nietzsche, the philosopher Nietzsche, and his representation of this internal diversity of Europe. And he goes through three representative examples of what for him is always Europe as the Europe of the middle. He only gives three examples, and as far as I can see, philosophers almost only ever give three examples of Europeans, and almost invariably, astonishingly invariably, it's the same three. If you put the three in your head now, you probably know who they are. It's Germany, France, and what people outside my country call England. Germany, France, England. For Nietzsche, Germans are what he calls the people of the middle in every sense. Well, I have no idea what every sense means, but there they are. As it were, they're the exemplary people of the middle. He calls the French born Mittelländler. Now, I've just read a German word there. Again, I don't know what the text is going to make of this, but born Mittelländler. In the English, it's translated as born Mediterraneans, which makes a lot of sense. But Mediterranean in French is in German rather, is Mittelmeer, not Mittelländler. Born Mittelländler means born Midlanders. So they're people of the middle too. And the English, who he has a lot of fun with, and if Luis wants a laugh, just read Nietzsche on the English. They're the mediocre ones, which also means middle. The English are the mediocre spirits who, in Nietzsche's view, dominate the middle regions of Europe in his time. So they too are the middle of the middle. So you have these different variations for Nietzsche of the internal differentiation seen through the figure of the Europe of the middle. One of the most extraordinary moments in Nietzsche's text on these representative Europeans is that having just demolished the English, what he calls the English, Hume, for example, is called English. Hume, of course, is Scottish. But a lot of people get into trouble with Hume when they speak the language of calling this place England. John Stuart Mill himself called Hume English brackets Scottish, which is just as stupid. But anyway, Nietzsche having demolished the English spirit, this mediocre spirit dominating the middle regions of Europe, he then unbelievably says, and who would deny that these spirits, such spirits, should rule or dominate for a while, for a while. But he welcomes the domination of these mediocre spirits in Europe in his time. Now there's a kind of tricky problem now, because if we allow, as it were, for the sake of argument, the English to dominate, then what they're dominating with is the English conception of Europe, which is not a conception of Europe as the middle. It's if it's anything, and we'll see it is something, it's a Europe of the Atlantic conception. Of course, not one that England would have alone, although perhaps a decent representative of the Europe of the Atlantic position, but it would also be one that we could find in Portugal and in Northern Europe, in Scandinavia. But in any case, when Nietzsche allows the English to dominate, then the conception of Europe that is allowed to dominate is this other configuration, a configuration which figures Europe differently, not a Europe of the middle, but a Europe of the Atlantic. And I'm going to share a second slide with you now, which is, as it were, a representative example of this English conception of Europe. And this is from Mill. Now, this is from Mill in a text called On Liberty, of Liberty, and he's at the moment, in a way that one would never do today is compare Europe to China. Of course, people still do that. But what he was looking at was a China that had become, in the eyes of many Europeans, what he calls stationary. So Chinese culture simply hadn't changed very dramatically at all for an extremely long time. And Mill makes a contrast, whose language is still with us, and Americans certainly use it a lot themselves, a progressive culture and a stationary culture. And Mill's wondering what has allowed Europe to remain progressive and not to become stationary. So, what has hitherto preserved Europe from becoming another China? Not any superior excellence in the European family, which, when it exists as the effect, not as the cause, but their remarkable diversity of character and culture. Individuals, classes, nations have been extremely unlike each other. They have struck out a great variety of paths, each leading to something valuable. And although at every period those who travelled in different paths have been extremely intolerant of one another, and each would have thought it an excellent thing if all the rest could have been compelled to travel his road, their attempts to thwart each other's development have rarely had any permanent success, and each has in time endured to receive the good which the others have offered. Europe is, in my judgment, wholly indebted to, and I actually can't see the words there because it's being cut off by the, by the sometimes this plurality of paths. Europe is, in my judgment, wholly indebted to this plurality of paths for its progressive and many-sided development. Well, in the end, for Mill, I'm going to leave this up just for a second. In the end, for Mill, plurality is Europe's irreducible excellence, its many-sided development, its remarkable diversity, the insistent mark of what is valuable in Europe itself. A good overall that each nation has a hand in creating, and each has a hand in threatening. As he says here, each would have thought it an excellent thing if all the rest could have been compelled to travel his road. Now, the perhaps paradoxical virtue of Nietzsche's letting English spirits like Mill dominate for any time would then lie in this, that travelling their over Europe road, their domination of Europe, would require a setup for Europe overall that best enables every other to travel his own, and hence for each to remain in a condition fit to receive the good which the others have offered, without colonizing compulsion. Perhaps it could then even cultivate the chance of replacing the extreme intolerance, expansionism, and life-saturating nationalism with mutual respect, good neighbourliness, and perhaps occasionally warm-hearted patriotism. Well, England, you may not surprise you to hear, has really not dominated in the politics of European Union. Now, most of my paper is about this, and I'm not going to talk about this in any detail at all, but if we think about the politics of European integration through the lens of an understanding of a great maxim, beautiful vague words of European togetherness, ever closer union among the peoples of Europe, ever closer union among the peoples of Europe. If we look at the politics of European integration through the lens of that motto, for England, we, the ones, the ever close union among the peoples of Europe, we, the Europeans, are the community that is not one. It remains plural. The whole point for Mill in thinking about any measure of progressive culture in Europe in its history has been entirely due to what he calls its many-sided development, its remarkable diversity. It's the preservation of that diversity which has been at the heart of the English political project of European integration, a political project through and through, not against Europe, but against another kind of interpretation of ever closer union, which really does want Europe to become one. There's a German, this is not particular Germans, but as it were, a German language way of putting this is that this Europe that would become one would be, like Germany, a great federal state. We can also put this in French. It would be Europe as a great republic. And when the English hear this, they hear a great superstate, and they don't want it. And they think the people of Europe, the peoples and people of Europe, don't want it either. One of the final figures that I look at in the English-British politics of European integration is Prime Minister Tony Blair, and a speech he gave in Poland. And I'm going to share a tiny bit of his speech now, if I can. This is Tony Blair speaking in Warsaw. We want a union of nations, not a federal superstate. And that vision is shared by the majority of countries and people in Europe. A European superstate would neither have the efficacy or legitimacy to meet the global challenge. I reject the notion that the true Europe is to be found only in the European Commission and European Parliament. The European Union is a balance between the community and the intergovernmental. What we need to do is to strengthen Europe where necessary at every level. But the fount of authority lies in the free will of nations, collectively expressed. We need to root the European vision in the identity of the nations that make up Europe. I was going to read one little bit from the end of my paper and come to a conclusion. Well, for Blair, the future of the EU lay not in the possibility of a new European federal government, not a new state-like bureaucracy, but in improved coordination on policies that could make the EU the champion of this global, outward-looking, competitive Europe, his words. It's a classic Europe of the Atlantic figure of Europe, still clearly in view here, but now in the form of what one might call a post-imperial Europeanization. It was, I think, in my opinion, it was a promising development, but in reality, it was only nascently and weakly making its generational way in Britain itself. And Blair's pro-European speech to the European Parliament was greeted with jeers by Britain's own UKIP MEPs. Increasingly hostile to what they saw as centralising forces in the EU overwhelming political freedom, including political freedom in the UK, the right wing in Britain saw the EU as a regulatory fetter to a self-confident and still globally voyaging Britain. Meanwhile, sections of the left framed the EU as a deregulating neoliberal trap and part of a neoliberal hegemony increasingly becoming global. For that part of the left, it was better for Britain to escape the EU altogether. Many UK citizens were simply feeling something that Britain was losing itself, not renewing itself, at least not in Europe. And in a desperately ill-conceived bid by Prime Minister David Cameron to quell the divisions, he called for a referendum on Britain's membership, which of course was lost. I will share now my final screen, which is an explanation, at least one explanation, of why it lost. And this is England Scotland. This is the campaign, a photograph from the campaign for remaining in that belonged to Scottish politics. And from left to right, you have the national leaders, Scottish national leaders of their parties in the Green Party, the Conservative Party, the Labour Party, and the Scottish National Party. They all stood together, all stood to remain in. There was unfortunately no such unity over Britain itself. In the national UK parties, one person in particular, one national leader, simply refused to campaign with anybody else. It was a disaster in the making. I was going to read out one more thing. Let's see if, yeah. As a result of the definitive referendum result, the hope that the UK might find a new post-imperial Europe of the Atlantic sense of itself as a large and influential European country, the hope for its post-imperial Europeanization was, whether temporarily or permanently, we do not know, overnight extinguished. It will not dominate even for a while, at least for a while. That is a problem for Britain. It may yet prove a problem for Europe. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Simon. That was a wonderful, I would say, not summary, but addition in some aspects to your original paper, which I found tremendously engaging. I particularly liked how you were able to combine references and an analysis of philosophical discourse with the political discourse as expressed by different prime ministers. And I guess that the first question that comes up regarding that is, how much do you find that philosophical discourse has informed those official discourses about Europe? Because after all, they are not really the prime minister speaking, and maybe touching on a different topic of your liking, which is spectrality, the role of the ghostwriter. Who are the actual authors of these speeches, and how well read or not or influenced are they by philosophical discourse?
This is a terribly difficult question. I'm going to take an easy way out first, Luis, which is when I'm looking at the European Union with my students, I say, well, we better start from at least the places where something like European integration begins to be projected. Now, where was that project projected? It was projected first in philosophy. I'm going to give some examples of this in a moment, but it doesn't just happen to be philosophers who first presented a projection of a future integration of Europe in a political way. It is a philosophical project from the beginning. And that is because the philosophers who wrote it believed in the human universality that I began sketching out right at the beginning of my talk. If you believe in a human universality of ourselves as, let's say, the theomorphic rational animal, if this is a human universal, then conditions of war, antagonism, disruptive relations can't belong, as it were, essentially to what we are. A progressive development for that animal would be towards conditions of peace, away from war towards peace, away from unfreedom towards freedom, away from unhappiness towards happiness. So all these histories of universal histories of man that emerged in philosophy crystallize in an idea of a universal humanity. These were all European thinkers who all thought Europe was at the head of this development, and all thought that the first movement of integration of human beings into a Pacific community, Pacific not because it's anywhere near the Pacific Ocean, Pacific because it's about peace, a Pacific community, sometimes called a cosmopolitan community, so that the political animal becomes a cosmopolitical animal. These all emerged in philosophy, and the greatest, most significant contribution to this whole project of projecting European Union comes with the work of Immanuel Kant in the 1780s and 1790s. Kant thought it would take about 200 years before it might realize itself in reality. And he would ridicule others who thought it was going to come tomorrow. I mean, it was in the air, but he was the first to really project a kind of map of what Europe would look like under conditions of political integration, under what he called a great political body of the future without precedents in the past. Now, Kant's writing on this is on, as it were, page 1 of the European Union website, if they had page numbers like that. Kant is, as it were, the lodestone, the first seer, projector, calling to be this European political space. So to see this ghostwriting, Louis, if you look at the speeches, in fact, there were 2 speeches on the occasion of the European Union being awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. The 2 representatives from the European Union who gave speeches then were almost quoting Kant. They could have almost been quoting Kant. However, no philosopher of any great significance until the 20th century anyway, thought that European integration would be a movement towards a state-like institution. Kant himself said it would be a federation of states. Nietzsche, 100 years later than Kant, also saw it as a great federation. These would be a community of, how does Kant put it? It's a federation of free states. And this is very much the tradition that British politics has been situated in. Not what Nietzsche calls the exalted dreams of the French and Germans, who Nietzsche thinks fly too high, too fast, but these less exalted, mediocre visions of a less substantial political entity. And Britain has just absolutely settled in the culture of a philosophical culture of Europe and its political significance, as you saw in the Blair quote there, having its fount in free nations and nothing else. In Mill, you have that idea of the irreducible plurality at the bottom of everything. And for whatever reason, this came to be the British conviction. It undoubtedly is. And I think that it's in good, personally, I think it's in good part good. And I think it's in main part Kantian, which is a kind of remarkable fact. I've no idea how Kant's ghost got in there, but there it is.
So that Atlantic vision is in origin a Prussian vision in a way.
Well, in some part of itself. The Atlantic part is actually another, maybe we can talk about this because I didn't mention it much. If we look at the Derrida quote again, I'll just see if I can scoop this up quickly.
Okay.
There. Europe of the Atlantic, the point of departure for discovery, invention, and colonization. Now, I put that up just to remind us that Europe is understood by Britain from the point of view of empire and European empires. Europe is understood as the space of empire. And what you see through the 20th century is as decolonization begins to take place, as independence struggles run through the whole of that British Empire and European empires, that British self-understanding becomes, as it were, the Atlantic dimension becomes more about possibilities of Europe being a global player, not about being an imperial power in the old sense. But it doesn't go away. I don't think that was really part of Kant's vision, and it certainly remains something of the British one.
Speaking of empire, and maybe moving on to Festung Europa, we have a question from our colleague Michaela Hennicke-Moore from the History Department. She says, "Thank you for a fantastic paper and wonderful talk. Might you be willing to comment on how fascism and perhaps Nazism specifically fit into a philosophical understanding of Europe?" Thank you, Michaela.
Well, that's a really interesting question. Here's two thoughts. Part one, the representation of the history of humanity that you get in European universal history is where the whole of humanity is moving from a position in which it begins in some primitive, savage, barbaric condition, moving over time towards some increasingly rational, scientific culture with Europe at the head. It's a sort of horizontal scale, and everybody can take part in it. Nobody's left behind. But the Europeans say some people are further behind than we are. So the Europeans are at the head, and others are somewhere else along the line behind and have a lot of catching up to do, according to that old European image. Now, it remains a humanism, a universalism. So you could say it avoids the worst of certain kinds of racism, but it still looks upon certain kinds of human beings as at a stage prior to the European stage on the same scale. So the new book I'm writing at the moment is looking at what the Europeans call the savage and the primitive, and whether our understanding of that is in any way something one could still imagine affirming. But there it is, that horizontal line. Now, fascism and racism come into play when that horizontal line is made vertical through a kind of scientific treatment of these human differences. So science, of course, is what the Europeans had thought of them their greatest achievement and set them out at the front. But now these sciences themselves, so the racists claimed, would demonstrate that this horizontal line was really a vertical one, and that some would permanently at the bottom, and others were suited best to be at the top. That European head of the pack position is, as it were, hardwired into nature, science tells us, not a sort of more or less inexplicable contingency of world history. And so raciology takes over universal history as a science of human differences and begins to justify that conception of the other as primitive, as being a permanent feature of the human condition rather than a transitory one. So instead of an end which would look like a world community in peace, with respect to every other, which is what the cosmopolitics of someone like Kant proposes, you have a raciology of racial domination and so on. And that scientific conception of humanity that makes its way out of that more humanistic tradition flourishes in the 20th century. That was part one of the answer. I think I may have either forgotten part two or I've spoken too long, one or the other. And just think for a moment.
I think that was great. But along those lines, I wanted to ask you on your work on the philosophy of Europe. What role does post-colonial theory, post-colonial approaches, and the relatively recent discourses on Eurocentrism, do they inform your reading of this whole issue?
Well,
in other words, how do you avoid or engage with the label of Eurocentrism?
Oh, wow. Well, I guess I engage with this question because Eurocentrism is the central feature of the text that I'm reading. and I don't read them uncritically. I don't say, the whole heritage of Europe has been Eurocentric, and I countersign this and affirm it myself. On the contrary, the 2-volume book is about the falling apart of the world in which that Eurocentrism made sense. So the first dimension of the book is trying to make sense of a world in which that Eurocentrism was matter of course for Europeans, and then trying to understand how that conception of European centrality collapses through the 20th century, not least because of the outrages of fascism, Nazism, Stalinism that ravaged Europe through so much of the 20th century. And of course, as I've mentioned already, the struggles, decolonial struggles, and the end of empire, as it were. So I don't think I have to do any kind of how do you avoid being called Eurocentric. There is, of course, one issue here that historians of Europe, which I'm not a philosopher of Europe, but a historian of Europe always says at the beginning of their books, which is you're not Eurocentric just because you're talking about Europe. that just means that's your topic. Your topic could be whatever. And of course, I didn't turn to the philosophy of Europe until I worked in something called the European Institute, where basically we're all expected to work on Europe. So yes, Europe is, as it were, the topic, and the European self-understanding is my theme. And of course, that self-understanding is the heritage of my own. So I'm not outside the story that I'm recounting. I'm inside. It's my own heritage, as it were, that's under examination critically. And I'm watching a heritage falling apart and trying to come to terms with what it means to be a European today, where actually I say we want neither Eurocentrism nor anti-Eurocentrism. And if I may just say a word on that, Louise, it's being opposed to all Eurocentrism is very fundamental to the work that I'm undertaking. But I take very seriously the thought that anti-Eurocentrism is just the inverse mirror of Eurocentrism. To suppose, on the one hand, you have the Eurocentric backslapping self-congratulation, and then on the other hand, you have the suggestion that Europe is simply the place of origin of every single disaster that's ever befallen humanity, the best and the worst, as it were. One is just the opposite of the other, the sort of polar, on a magnetic pole. It's just the switch the charge in the other direction. And not only does anti-Eurocentrism at that point just simply mirror Eurocentric logic, which I think is a disaster. If you think that through, then the picture of universal history, which begins on the Eurocentric vision as one in which there's this origin condition of savage primitive humanity towards rational civilized humanity. Anti-Eurocentrism supposes that that movement is not one of progress, but one of fall, a decline, a collapse. And that position is Rousseau. It's an absolutely standard European self-understanding that what the European is in a certain sense human beings after the fall, out of some natural primitiveness which was peaceful and good, and into this disaster of Europe. Now, anti-Eurocentrism then, seeing world history as the history of the world after the fall, is as much part of the European heritage as the Eurocentric vision. So you don't escape Europe just by being anti-Eurocentric. On the other hand, on the contrary, you actually place yourself much more firmly within it. And every European apology of Europe, as it were, in an anti-Eurocentric way, belongs to that heritage just as much as every backslapping Euro supremacist.
And within this heritage that you somehow study in what I assume are going to be these 2 volumes, have you found any voices of note that you think have been somehow neglected especially in the Anglophone world, that you would like to emphasize their importance? Because it's what one finds in many of these books about the history of the philosophy of Europe is the classic triad of Husserl, Heidegger, and Derrida.
Yeah.
But are there other thinkers that you think are worth considering for this?
Yeah, I'm going to share a photo with you now, if you don't mind, because this is hysterical. I shared this with my students last week. This is a great one. This is the other trio, Kant, Hegel, Marx. And the person who I have introduced in the book, who is perhaps underread today, I did mention today, and that is Paul Valery, the French poet. He's as controversial a figure as anyone else. It wasn't like he was some super wonderful person you'd want to spend a lot of time with. But he is an extraordinary thinker of Europe, a kind of somebody bearing witness to Europe in the 20th century. So Paul Valery's writing about Europe from the 1919, at the end of the First World War, up to the 1940s, as Germany again becomes an aggressive power in Europe. And there's this wonderful image he gives at one point of a European Hamlet looking over Europe, and he picks up a skull, and this Hamlet says, "And this one was Kant, and Kant begat Hegel, and Hegel begat Marx, and Marx begat ... and he stops it there. So this trio too, very important. And most important, if you remember that Paul Valery is a poet, that ... is not insignificant. Mm-hmm. Kant begat Hegel, Hegel begat Marx, and Marx begat ... We are in the dots. We are. We the Europeans are in those dots. We live in a time after Marx and after Kant and Hegel too, but also those others that you mentioned who came after those three. If you look at Husserl, how far he is trying to reactivate a tradition that goes back to Kant and Hegel, and in some ways attempts to do so without being Marxist, and also in profound opposition at that point to the raciology of the Nazis, which were literally affecting him in his life. Now, you mentioned Husserl, Heidegger. Heidegger I don't talk about. In my first draft, I had a chapter on Heidegger, and I took it out. I literally had enough. I replaced talk of Heidegger with actual quotations from Hitler, from Mein Kampf, which was bad enough. But I didn't want this sort of siphoned through Heidegger anymore. Anyway, Heidegger is a great genius, and without doubt, but I did in the end get rid of him from my books.
And Gachet did it already.
Yeah, others have done that. Have done that. So, but Paul Valery is the what was the word you used? Underrepresented, under something. I can't remember what you said.
I don't know really, but no, I think I'm delighted to hear that as a literary scholar that you are also considering the works of non-philosophers.
Yeah, very important. I mean, actually, in the new work on ghosts, the non-philosophers are much more important. The anthropologists are central there. But I will say one thing, that the books I've written are all about the dominant self-understanding. So one of the most interesting features of recent scholarship in the second half of the 20th century is the recovery of voices which were lost because they were not dominant, because they were marginal voices. That's a hugely important and absolutely unforgettable kind of activity of scholarship today. But I'm quite deliberately looking at the dominant self-understanding. So how, when Europe reflects on itself, does it, as it were, what is the dominant voice in that? Not in order to celebrate that, but to just understand it. That's because that's the one that, as it were, has been historically active in the self-appearing of Europe. Now, of course, there's not just one voice, and indeed it changes over time. But it is certainly true that when you're interested in the dominant self-understanding, these interruptions of that from the margins have a different role to play, and it's not the thing that I'm looking at. I mean, I do think it's very important if you look at, as it were, marginal voices, marginal to what, right? And one mustn't assume too quickly that we know what it's marginal to. If you just assume already that we know exactly what that is, well, then we've given up another line of scholarship altogether. So understanding the dominant culture, to know, as it were, the world into which one is inserted, for me, it's important to explore the heritage and history of that domination, but also, as I've indicated, its decline and its falling apart.
And also, by doing that, exploring the processes by which those marginalized voices become marginal, right? Maybe to end up along those lines, as things go with British politics right now, are you yourself going to start considering your own point of view as marginal to the rest of Europe? And is that going to give you somehow a privileged standpoint as a thinker to think about Europe, as in being both inside and outside?
That's a really good question. I mean, we don't know where Britain is in fact going to land up. I mean, it certainly won't be inside as being a member for many, many years to come now. However, how far outside it can possibly remain is another question. And I haven't really made too many predictions along the way, but I have always assumed, since the referendum was conducted and Britain voted to leave, that the end point of that process would be one where a deal would be done and some settlement would be made, and that in British terms it would more or less go along on as it was before. Now, certain things will be different, but the question is, like, how much they could really, how much a British government could really produce an upheaval of the kind that attempted to unpick 50 years of integration in Europe. It would seem to me exceptionally unlikely. So I'm on the side of people who think that wherever the UK lands up, it will unavoidably probably be quite close to Europe in lots of ways, lots of continuing involvements. And for academics, many of the involvements will remain exactly as they've been. I imagine, I may be totally wrong, but I imagine that British universities will remain part of the European Research Council, and that British medical establishments will remain in close communication with European partners and so on. Those partnerships are too well embedded in the whole fabric of the economies for them to be just ripped up overnight. I just can't see it. I mean, I could be completely wrong. It may be that we're going to find out in January that Britain's just sunk itself in the English Channel, and that there would be hardly anything left to survive it. But that's not really about your question. Was about the position of somebody who's then both inside and outside. In the quote that I had from Tony Blair, I must say, this is not a Tony Blair fan club, but it's just, his voice was representative there of a political vision of European integration that I'm sympathetic with. He says that what he's calling the British view is not just the British view. It's common all over Europe. He was obviously speaking in Poland at that time, where he thought it would be well received. Nietzsche, when he says the British should, or the English should dominate for a while, he actually says such spirits. He doesn't say English spirits, he says such spirits. So they don't actually have to be English. And I think that, as it were, what I'm talking about as the English spirit of Europe, or through Nietzsche there, which is the idea of a community that is not one, a community that is best understood as Kant understood it, as a federation of free states, as a united Europe of states, not a United States of Europe. That alternative will remain absolutely live. Now, it will have lost its greatest champion, with Britain now being outside, which I think is actually a problem for Europe, not for Britain. Britain will be doing whatever it does in that respect. But if Europe doesn't have that other voice, and if Europe becomes increasingly a kind of dialogue, a sort of ongoing conversation, particularly between Germany and France, I don't think that's a great kind of situation for Europe to find itself in, where Germany and France are, as it were, rivals for whose Europe is going to be the leading conception of Europe. Britain played this fairly complicated, but nevertheless perhaps helpful role of being this third party in these three.
Following that metaphor, the people in the middle, right?
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
Mediocre in the sense of mediating between.
Yes, the mediators. And Europe having lost that, it's not that could be a problem for Europe. The problems for Britain, I must say, are much bigger. Like, I mean, as I say, I hope we're not heading for disaster, but I really don't know where we are heading, particularly. Mind you, Iowa will be having its own worries today about where you're heading.
Well, as Derrida said, the other head. We'll talk about some other day. Well, thank you so much, Simon. It has been a great pleasure to have you with us. Congratulations on that forthcoming book in 2 volumes, which is coming out in the spring, from Routledge.
That's right. Yeah.
We are really looking forward to reading it. Thank you so much, and thank you to all of our viewers. Next semester, we will have 2 similar events, webinars with 2 thinkers from Europe. One will be with Mieke Bal, the great Dutch theorist, and the other one with Paul Preciado, who is a philosopher. Currently, he's at the Pompidou Center in Paris as the resident philosopher. Thank you so much again, Simon, and hope to talk to you again very soon. Thank you.
Thank you, Luis. Thank you. Good night.